everyone, it's time to get into the zone, the emulation zone. I'm Jeff Gerstmann. Emulation is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's brought us so much over the years. I guess as a little history, I remember finding out that you could use a PC to play old console games. Well, old Game Boy games. Back around probably 1995, 1996, somewhere in there. And that's really all you could do. The concept of emulating an NES hadn't really happened yet. There were some attempts not too far off in the future of that, and eventually Super Nintendo would follow with an emulator, I believe it was called VSMC, and it didn't work well. And the NES emulation, there was this Japanese emulator called Paso Fami that everything was yellow because they wanted you to register it, and so there's a cracked version going around that made the palette right, and it was a mess. In the early days, it was really about Game Boy, which ran pretty well. And then eventually there was some arcade emulation. A Pac-Man emulator that started to emulate more than just Pac-Man because there was hardware similarities between Pac-Man and, Galaxian or Galaga or Dig Dug or some of these other Namco games eventually kind of blossomed out. And that emulator was eventually renamed MAME, the multi-arcade machine emulator. And MAME has been going on strong ever since then. These days, there's a monthly release of MAME the last Wednesday of every month, give or take. They're sometimes they're a little late with it. But they bundle up their month's worth of progress and they put it out. And MAME does a lot more than just play. MAME is for more than playing Pac-Man in this day and age. But the thing the thing I've been finding is that a lot of people find it intimidating to get started with all of this stuff, whether it's MAME or whether it's, emulating more modern, PlayStation 2 games or Super Nintendo games or Dreamcast games or whatever, setting up the emulator, getting the right files in the right place, how to decide if you have the right version of the file, because sometimes there are multiple versions of the same game out there, and some of them are, you get them weird places because it's a weird thing, and you end up with bad dumps of cartridges that don't work right, or, weird, you never know what you end up with. There are tools out there that help you to verify that what you have is indeed the right stuff. And so I wanted to produce a set of videos. I'm not really sure how many installments we'll need to get through this stuff. But I wanted to produce a set of videos that'll show you things like how to maintain a ROM set, how to verify your ROMs against a database of known good dumps or best available dumps in some cases. We love the dumps. And what is the difference between some of these file formats? Some people will get Dreamcast games in CDI format instead of bins and queues, or, like all these different file types that you might encounter when you're out there online, or you are even, ripping your own games. The file format stuff is, can sometimes be mysterious. And so I've always come from a place that, like, again, because I had this foundation with MAME and with a lot of the bad tools that were out there back in the day to kind of verify what was what. From my perspective, we've got it pretty good now because it used to be pretty bad. So I thought I would start this first installment with MAME because I think a lot of the foundational things about how MAME is built and how it expects you to put your files in certain places, to put your games in certain places, is a great starting point for kind of what's to come in when we look at RetroArch, or when we look at using DAT files to maintain a database of a full ROM set, or what have you. A lot of this knowledge, I think, is born out of MAME. It's been around forever, especially when it comes to arcade emulators, or arcade games that run on the Mister. Generally speaking, they pull the ROM sets, the same ROM sets that MAME uses, in the same format, the same basic structure. And so learning MAME in a lot of ways, and learning the tools used to maintain MAME month in and month out, I think will give you something foundational that you can perhaps apply to other things down the line. But we will get into that as we go. So let's head over to my conspicuously blank desktop that I dragged into a folder and moved away. I've decided to start with a brand new installation of MAME. I've gone ahead and created a directory in my on my E drive, which is where all the emulation stuff lives on this machine. For starters, we're gonna, you just go to mamedev.org and you can download whatever the current version of MAME is. It's an executable, but also it's a 7-zip archive, so you can open it either way. And you can take this copy of MAME here. I'll just drag it over to this directory. It will do its thing. Now, what you're getting here is it's a variety of files. There's a bunch of executables here that may look intimidating. CHDman and LD resample and LD verify and image tool, and all these sorts of things. You kind of don't need to know any of these. I'm not going to say you can delete them, because I don't know if any of them factor into the running of MAME, but really the file we really care about here is mame.exe. It also creates some additional directories here that is kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about to get started here. There is a directory for artwork, and so if you want to really set it up this way, you can go find people have gotten the bezel artwork that would go around an arcade machine's monitor, and they've got really nice scans and touched up images of those, and you can go grab those and put them into this directory and name them appropriately. That's a whole separate process that, honestly, that's not something I am always most clear on, because it's just not something I do. It's not something I really need. And so once every year or so, I download all the artwork and get it all configured, and I look at it and go like, yeah, I don't want this stuff. I want the game to be bigger on the monitor, not shrunk down and surrounded by this artwork. So that's more or less kind of beyond the scope of this. For our purposes, the directories we're really going to care about here is going to be the ROMs directory. This is where your ROMs go. The samples directory we'll get into a little, probably near the end. And the ini directory may come into play here as we mess with config files and the actual running of the emulator once all of that is done. So, ROMs, what are they? They're dumps of chips at the end of the day. A lot of them are packaged up differently, depending on what you're looking for, or depending on what you're looking at, rather. A .NES file, which would be a ROM of a Nintendo Entertainment System game, is kind of just an archive of the 3 or 4 or however many different chips inside the cartridge strung together with a header file often attached to it to let the emulator know what it's looking at. Some of these dumps are just raw dumps, and they don't have any additional header information. They don't need it or what have you. Generally speaking, with MAME ROMs, what you're going to find is a collection of files, not just a single file. I'll grab, this is the ROMs directory from my previously existing MAME installation, which we'll be using as a source for these ROM files. We'll look up Pac-Man here. And I will open this directory, or open this archive here. And what is it under Puckman? Because it's the Japanese version of the, yes. So, and what we'll see here is a handful of different files. A 7F file, a 3M file, a 1M file. In a lot of cases, these will correspond to, the naming conventions of MAME are a little bit beyond me. But in a lot of cases, you will find if you were looking at a board, if you had a Pac-Man board in front of you, that some of these sockets might be labeled, or someone might have like put tape on them and written 7F, or, the different program ROMs of a cabinet are represented here. And basically what MAME does is it emulates the processors that were required to run a game like Pac-Man. The ROMs here provide the information, whether that's graphics, sound, the code of the game itself, the color palette. That was a thing that MAME did poorly for a lot of years, and they changed it up and did a lot of stuff that way, that they've gotten a lot better at over the years. And so what that means is sometimes, it happens a lot less often these days, but sometimes these ROMs change. You might go 1 month to the next month and like Pac-Man doesn't work anymore. Pac-Man was probably safe at this point, but a game might not work from month to month because they have gotten better information. They have redumped some ROMs if they have bad dumps, which does happen because some of these boards are exceedingly rare. And so in some cases, they only have the best available dumps they have are corrupt in some way. And then they happen upon, this guy in Switzerland turned out to have this rare prototype board, and we were able to dump it, and that solves this. And so, so basically, because it is not a static thing and MAME is always moving forward, that's why the ROMs may change. They don't change dramatically from month to month. But when you talk about people, there are a lot of people out there that believe in like a super old version of MAME for whatever reason. And they're always like, I got the ROMs for this set, and I got the ROMs for this set, and they don't work anymore. Why doesn't it work anymore? It's like, well, because it's been 7 years or something since that, with those ROMs you're using. MAME has improved a ton since then. And so, of course, some of those files are going to change as the information improves. And as more ROM dumps became available to the developers of MAME, they improved the program accordingly. I tend to stay up to date with MAME. When a new MAME comes out, I go, ooh, and I download it, and I look at what's new, and I try to update my sets, and there are sources and places to find this stuff that, again, are kind of beyond the scope of this tutorial. Search engines exist. Like, this stuff is out there. I'm not going to teach you how to use the internet. So the structure of these games, you'll find all these individual little files, and where do they go? How do you know where to put them? Where do they all live? They all live in your ROMs directory. But generally speaking, MAME is looking for them in a very kind of set way. Or rather, one of 3 different types of ways. You'll notice that I have these additional directories here with all of these. These are other versions of Pac-Man, because MAME plays a lot of different versions of Pac-Man, or Puckman, or Hangly Man, which is another weird bootleg. And so we see in our Hangly Man folder, these are some other ROMs that these would be on the board instead of some of these. Or Abscam, which is another Pac-Man hack that is ridiculous. How you organize these ROMs, ultimately, you will have some choices to make. I will tell you about why I store them all in one file like this, one zip file, instead of individual zip files for each game, and so on and so forth. There are considerations to be made with that we'll get into here in a minute. In addition to just, straight up dumps of computer chips, newer games, there are additionally games in MAME, games supported in MAME that originally had other types of media, whether that be a hard drive, like something like Killer Instinct or NFL Blitz, or a CD-ROM drive in the case of something like a Dance Dance Revolution, or a GD-ROM drive in the case of some of Sega's Naomi hardware games, or a Laserdisc in the case of something like Dragon's Lair. For that type of media, MAME has a format called CHD, which you may be familiar with because it's a relatively generic format that you could take a PlayStation game and convert it into a CHD file. It's kind of just like it's a zipped up, it's compressed, so it's a little smaller than it would be if it was just a raw dump of the data. You see that this NFL Blitz hard drive is, 255 megs here. Not that bad. Some of these CHDs get pretty big. If I remember, Dragon's Lair, yeah, that's 12 gigs right there. Laserdiscs turn out they don't compress nearly as well as some of this other stuff. The CHDs go in your ROM directory like anything else, and this is kind of an additional kind of stumbling point, I think, for some people, because you will oftentimes find online a full MAME ROM set that does not include the CHDs because they're bigger than the rest of the entire set combined. All of these different hard drives for, NBA Showtime, that's half a gig. How big is Area 51? That's, 2 files here that are about half a gig each. You got a 1.6 here. This is what is this? This is the Area 51 Max Force combo cabinet. Ultimately, I like having a full set of MAME ROMs. And so I'm going to be focusing on that. If you are interested in having a partial set, some of this advice will still apply to you, but you will, some of these tools will always tell you that you're missing something, because a lot of these tools are built around the idea of what do you have, what do you not have. And so I just say, hey, hard drives are not that expensive these days. Might as well just have it all. Right? So we're going to take our new MAME ROM directory. We're going to take our old MAME ROM directory. This is kind of a source and destination is how we will eventually come to look at this. But how do we know? Like, let's say we just stumbled upon a directory full of MAME games online, and they're, let's say they're not named as cleanly as this set is. It's just a directory. It's a mess. We don't really know what we're looking at. How do we get things from point A to point B so that MAME has them, so that MAME knows where they are? They need to be over here for MAME to see them. Well, that's where this tool comes in. And it is called ClrMAME Pro, ClrMAME Pro, sometimes also referred to as CM Pro. And what this is an organizer for ROMs or, really any type of file. Basically, what you get is a DAT file. You get a database of here's the information about these files, the hashes, the particulars of each individual file. And you say, all of these things should be in this directory for it to be complete. And it will scan the directory. It will scan a source directory to look for the files if you've got them in a download directory or whatever. It will pull them out of there and move them and organize them according to how you have things set up. And it will kind of tell you what it found, what you have now, and what you're missing. So you know what to finish going out and look for. MAME is a special case in that the DAT file itself is the MAME executable. So what we're going to do here, because I've deleted it, is we're going to add a DAT file, or is it create? Sorry. Yes. We're going to create based on MAME. You see, it will take a handful of other emulators. These are, they're all kind of MAME at the end of the day. We will go here and we will go to the MAME directory I have created. We will pick mame.exe and we will call it MAME. And I will hit create profile. We're going to create it in, you can have a different, you can put this into ClrMAME Pro. You can organize into subfolders and do all this other stuff. We're going to put it in the root folder here. It's going to think about things for a little bit. And then now we've got the start of our MAME entry in this database. When you first click on this, it's going to read all the data out of the executable for what ROMs MAME is looking for. And this process will repeat on a monthly basis. Every time you get a new executable for MAME, it will basically, it'll look at this. It'll do this and go like, hey, a database update is required. And so it will run commands and it will pull all of this in. It's going to think about this for a while. And I believe it will eventually ask us some questions that we will probably say no to for the purposes of this demonstration. Cool. It's going to find some things along the way. This is sort of these error message. I'm tempted to just tell you, don't worry about it, because that's actually what the right answer is. But to tell you what this actually means, just briefly, yeah, you remember I talked about the samples folder here earlier. Some games have audio that is not properly emulated by the chips found in the arcade game for whatever reason. And so there are some cases where the MAME developers are instead taking just audio recordings and using those instead of emulating the hardware. Donkey Kong and MAME used to be done this way, where like they didn't have Mario's jump sound emulated because the hardware was beyond them at the time. I think they have since figured that out. And so you would have like a wave file of Mario jumping that you would throw in your samples directory. This will also track samples, and it will know if you are missing samples or if you have the samples. So we will get to that process as we kind of audit this set. But what it's saying here is that there's a sample set known as Gen Pin, and it's only a sample set because that means general pinball noises. And what it is it's like sounds of flippers and all this other shit in case you are trying to emulate a pinball machine, which is a weird thing to do with the mainline version of MAME that we're using here. But there are forks of MAME that you can use in theory to play digital recreations of pinball machines. Again, beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. And so I'm just going to say, okay, because what it is saying is that the Gen Pin set doesn't correspond to actual arcade ROMs. It's just something that is used in all of the arcade games that are emulated in MAME. There are a few sets like this that we will run into here. I'm going to turn my system sound down a little bit because you don't need to be hearing these noises like this. Fruit samples is the same thing, but for slot machines. There are a lot of British, I guess they call them fruit machines there. That existed in pubs, and those are also emulated by MAME. There's a lot of stuff emulated by MAME. It's a very interesting piece of software, and it's just become so crazy. Some of these, like, we can't merge them because it's got the same file name, but they're different files. And so you can kind of, it will sort it out and figure out where things need to go. And it will you can kind of just hit OK to all on that import process if you like. So here we have our main window for ClrMAME Pro. The first thing we need to go is to go into settings, because there's some stuff we need to set. We need to tell it where we want the ROMs to go when we're done. So you see here, ROM paths. That's the first one that's set up. We want to drag our ROM directory over there and say, this is where the ROMs go. Sample paths. We want to drag our sample folder over there. You can add this through the requester to, if you want to do it that way. The rest of these, you can kind of take it or leave it. The add path in ClrMAME Pro is if you have a download directory that you want every emulator to or every one of these scans to pull from. Like, let's say your downloads folder, which for me is my desktop. I think any sane person downloads things directly to their desktop and leaves them there for the rest of time, right? Right? A downloads directory is for cowards, but you could, have an add path here that exists just for this set, or you can go to global add paths, and these will appear for anything you use in ClrMAME Pro globally. But generally, I'm a drag and drop guy when it comes to a lot of ClrMAME Pro stuff these days. By default, when it makes changes, it will back these files up to a folder, which is handy. If those changes are reverted and you don't want to go download stuff again, you can find them in your backup folder and just run them through ClrMAME Pro again. Some additional options here if you want to, maintain the times and whatever else. You can do that if you want, I guess. I don't know. A few compressor settings here. But okay, so we've got our ROM path and our sample path set up. Really, that's kind of the only stuff you absolutely must configure. And then we really have kind of two options that we're going for here. The scanner is what you will use to scan the directory and say, what do I have? What do I have and what am I missing? And so we can just hit new scan. And it's like, hey man, this directory is empty. Are you sure you want to scan it? But we'll scan it anyway. And it's going to do this, and it's going to tell us that we are missing the entire set, basically. Ideally your scan results will not be this long because you will not be missing that much stuff. But we'll let it run. We're up to the D's. I don't know what the number, you see we have 15,000 items in our MAME ROMs folder over there on the left. But MAME plays more games than that because of the way I've got my ROMs stored. This is perhaps a good time to talk about this area here. Non-merged sets, split sets, and merged sets. There are basically 3 different ways to store your MAME ROMs. And I go with merged. But depending on your use case, you may want to store them differently. If you're also loading your MAME games into RetroArch, for example, and you don't want to have 2 copies of the same file, then non-merged sets would be the way to go. And we'll go back to Pac-Man here. And we'll go back to Puckman here, and we'll talk about it. Now, this is a merged set. Whoops. Well, and what that means is a lot of these games have multiple versions out there. And oftentimes those are regional. And so we have Puckman for the Japanese release. We have Pac-Man for the US release. For example, that's why there's a Pac-Man directory inside of puckman.zip. Now, all of these individual directories here could just be zip files out here. And what those zip files would contain depends on what we picked here. A non-merged set means that you will have a zip file for every game that MAME supports, and that zip file will contain every ROM that game needs to run. Whether it's a parent or a clone, it will have everything it needs. It'll be, here's pacman.zip. It is only good for running this one set of Pac-Man, but it has everything you need in it. That causes a lot of duplication because when we look at regional variants of games or update versions where it's like, oh, here's Street Fighter 2 and then here's the version where they took out Guile's handcuffs or whatever, right? Or here's, there are 4 different versions of X-Men versus Street Fighter because, well, there's way more than 4 once we get into the regional variants and some of the updated versions. And, because they're rebalancing it and then they send out new chips to arcades and say, here, replace these to fix this. It's a new version of the game. But it's usually like, hey, the differences between, let's look inside our Pac-Man directory and look at how many games, how many things are in here? Only 6. Now, a full Puckman set is way more than 6 files. So what that means is if you had a Puckman board and you wanted to make it a Pac-Man board, you could pop 6 chips out of it, replace the 6 chips with the US chips, and it would become Pac-Man. The other chips are universal. They're used in both versions of the game. So a non-merged set takes those universal chips and duplicates them across every single zip file you have. I think that's a lot of wasted space. So I don't like non-merged sets. But if you're not going to maintain a full set of everything MAME related, that could still be useful because you'll at least know that, like, hey, this zip file, if I copy it to my Steam Deck or I'm use it over here, use it over there, I know that this one zip file will have this one version of this game, and that's really all I want to play. Now, split sets. Split sets will result in the same number of zip files in your ROMs directory. You'll still have a pacman.zip and a puckman.zip. The difference is basically that puckman.zip will only contain these files, and pacman.zip will only contain the different files. So it'll only contain these. And so on and so forth. We look at the different clones of this game. You'll see like, oh, well, that would mean that hangly2.zip would only have these files in it because it only contains the different files. In that case, to run Pacman, the US Pacman, you need your pacman.zip and your puckman.zip, because puckman.zip is going to have files in it that are not duplicated in pacman.zip. What I tend to prefer is what you're looking at here, which is the merged set. What this does is it merges all of the clones into one zip file that is named for the parent set, which in this case is Puckman. MAME, when it comes to deciding what's the parent set and what's the clone set, they do have a codified kind of philosophy for this. And I think it's generally, you'll see it most with fighting games where the parent set is often the most recent, so like the last patched version of the world or European set in most cases. So the US version is treated as a clone. In some cases, the Japanese version is treated as a clone. In cases like Pac-Man, where that's, it's sort of a different scenario, the parent is the first version of it that was released, which is the Japanese version, Puckman. And so everything is a clone based off of that. So merged sets will basically give you fewer zip files in that directory. But you won't have a pacman.zip in this directory anymore because all of the files needed for Pac-Man are contained in the parent set known as puckman.zip. I hope that makes some sense. As I'm saying it, I'm like, this makes perfect sense. But I realize it's kind of a weird concept, especially because you don't really, the difference is largely personal. At this point, as someone who has spent so much time with MAME that, I remember a lot of the parent set names versus the clone set names. And so if I'm looking for an individual file, I'm rarely going to this directory to look for an individual file anyway. But in a lot of cases, I just kind of know what I'm looking for and where I need to look for it. So I tend to go with merged sets. Fewer files, just a little neater and cleaner to work with. And when you grab that file, it's going to have not only everything you need for that game, but all of its clones. So if you want to play the prototype version of Mr. Do, where he's a snowman instead of a clown, you know that you've got all of that stuff right there. Ultimately, MAME doesn't care which one of these you do. It will kind of automatically look for for it in regardless of these formats, because they all live in the same directory at the end of the day. Now, when you're scanning your ROMs, you can also have it fix things, which it will, you definitely want to check the one that's like, hey, if there are missing files in the add path, you definitely pull that in. But also, if it's, hey, the size is wrong, because sometimes you get an overdumped version of a file that it can fix. It knows how to fix it. You'll want to check that. I keep all of these checked, generally speaking, the fix files here. So we want the scanner to look for everything: sets, ROMs, samples, and CHDs. I prefer merged sets. It's going to prompt us before it goes to fix anything to let us know what it found that's wrong. And we want it to check for everything, and we want it to fix everything. Easy. Oh, well, I clicked that, and now it is thinking about something, and so who knows what the heck is happening now. Hopefully it doesn't just run a whole new scan. Um, this for a while there, the terminology was very silly because there were like non-merged sets, like full sets, um, merged sets, and then they used to call split sets split merged sets, I believe. And so the terminology for a MAME set just got weirder and weirder as time went on. I might force quit this and start it over again just because it's not doing anything relevant to what we are trying to accomplish here. So I'm gonna quit out of that and we'll relaunch it um and fire it back up. Okay. So we were in the scanner. We want it to fix everything. We want to use merged sets. Let me see if there's anything else relevant here that we want to think about here. We don't want to, you can, once you're a little more comfortable with some of this stuff, you can always dig into it and learn a little bit more about it. But for starters, we should be good. So these four things over here, CHDs are, like I said, are the images of hard drives and CD-ROMs and that sort of stuff that a lot of these machines, newer machines, use. Samples, as I said, are audio files that are used in place of accurate emulation. ROMs are the individual files. Sets are it's kind of the concept of like do you have all of the ROMs you need to make this set? I think I don't know what would happen if you scanned sets without scanning ROMs. That might be something that would be a little more valuable for console scanning or something like that. Now, the other thing we'll look at is the rebuilder. I think when you're thinking about MAME, or when you're thinking about ClrMAME, this rebuilding tool here, the scanner and the rebuilder are really the two places you kind of want to go. And here you can kind of set a few different things as it is finding ROMs. What do you want it to do with it? You can give it a source directory and then click rebuild. So we could give it this ROMs directory here and click rebuild, and it would rebuild the entire set over there. And this toggle here at the bottom right actually just toggles between the scanner and the rebuilder, which is very handy. Because like I said, those are kind of the two main things that you do when you're working with this program. We could use the rebuilder to rebuild a set, or I could actually just take these files and drag them onto the scan results window, and it will ingest the files and update the scan accordingly. I'm going to make some changes to my ROM collection here. I'm going to change them over to 7Z files, which MAME has supported for a while now. I did not know that, but it does indeed do that. We're going to rebuild merged sets. And we want them to be 7-zips. And also there's this option here, remove matched source files. So that means like if you've got a download directory, if you just downloaded a bunch of games and you want them to, and you know that they're MAME ROMs and you want them to be ingested and all other stuff, when they find ones that match, it will remove them from your downloads directory or from your source directory, wherever that may be. Sometimes you will want this, sometimes you will not, depending on what you're doing. As you work with more emulators and you find yourself in a situation where you might want to have two complete sets for two separate emulators in two different directories, but they share some ROMs, you would want to uncheck this because you don't want to yank it out of one emulator's ROM directory to put it in another. For example, that's the situation I run into most frequently. So we'll go back into our ROMs directory so we can kind of watch some of this stuff happen. And we'll just go and we'll take this Puckman that we've been talking about. We'll make that our first game to move over here. And I will just, oh, no, did not want to open it. We will drag it over to the window here. Again, these drag and drop things work fine. You could also just, again, set a source directory and do a whole directory at once, which is a much more automated way of doing it. Oh, is it because I don't have... Perhaps I don't have 7-zip configured properly. Let's change this to just .zip, and we'll worry about that some other time. Okay. Yes. Can't run 7z.exe. Please check settings compress. You know what? Damn it. If I'm going to do this, I want that. So we're going to go over to settings. We're going to go over to compressor. We're going to go to 7-zip here and try to figure this out. Let's see. What do we want to do? We want to go 7-zip. Can I open? Okay. Open file location. That's going to give us I'm sure there's a smoother way to do this. Okay. Perhaps if we feed it that, then it will be okay. We'll find out. And if not, then I'll just zip them. Moment of truth. I probably don't actually want the file manager because I think 7-zip keeps yeah, this is actually breaking because I gave it the wrong file because there is a 7z.exe sitting in the, yeah. Sorry. Okay. Okay. Let's look at these compressor settings one more time here. Oh, that's just reset to that, huh? Okay. Let's do this one more time. Yes, there. That is what is actually looking for. So. You spelled program wrong. Oh, my eyes. It's late at night. Okay. That looks okay to me. Well, let's see. Let's see if we can make this work. Okay, we want merge sets. We want this. We want that. We want puckman.zip. What do you got? Okay, forget it. Forget this whole 7-zip thing. I'll dick with that on my own time. Okay. Let's maybe I need to put quotes around it because it's got a space in the directory. You know, Windows things. Compressor. Actually, wait. We want to go back to the rebuilder. We want to compress files into zip file format. We want merged files. And now, once and for all, it will look at all these files. It will match them. It will create files where they need to go. It will skip some files that are not needed. And it will delete, because we have remove source files checked, it will remove those from this directory. Now, look at what we found here. Not only do we end up with a puckman.zip that contains all those files and all of those various, and it is decided to store them differently, which is interesting because these ROM sets are so old. It has basically also found files that apply to a number of other games, because you'll have some situations where, like, oh, this chip is also contained in a Frogger cabinet, or this data is part of Super Glob and all of and Super Xevious. And so you'll have a lot of times with especially with these older games where a lot of these games are just kind of shared between games. Let's move all this stuff back over. Well, you know what? Let's see. What would be let's try this with split sets checked and see what we end up with there. We'll clear this directory out again. We'll move everything over to this work directory, just a little temp directory here. And now with split sets checked, we'll go back over here and drag it on again and see what we get. Now you see we've got a Pac-Man zip, a Pac-Man BL zip, which is a bootleg Pac-Man. You know, so we end up with a lot more zip files along the way because it's moved all of those into different formats. If you get my meaning here, that's part of why I like merged sets. So we'll do this again with the way that we wanted it, which is to say merged. No, that's not what we're doing. Yeah, dragged it in the wrong place. Drag it over here. It will rebuild it yet again. The way we want it. Okay. So there we have our Pac-Man set and our Pac-Man sets rather, all contained in here. And they're this you know, my zip files are years old at this point, so I guess I'm not surprised that some of this stuff has changed in terms of how it is surfacing this stuff in a directory. It's a somewhat messier looking thing, which I think is kind of strange. But as long as they're in the zip file, that should still work just fine. So now we can actually just run MAME. You know, you don't need a full set to do this. You can just kind of freeball it a little bit. But let's do a different game here. Let's do a couple of other games here while we're here. We'll do Smash TV. We'll just grab this from here to here. They're all going to get tossed in here eventually, so we'll just do this. And it'll chew on these files for a while. Some of them are bigger than others, and it's going to, you know, be uncompressing the zip files and recompressing them. So, you know, depending on what you find. I recommend doing this while there is some temptation to just, like, when you get a new ROM set, just throw it in your MAME ROMs folder. You don't know what that is. You don't know what it's replacing. You don't know if it's a full set. You don't know this or that. So by doing it this way and letting ClrMAME audit your stuff, you ensure that the right files are in the right place. You're not supplying MAME with bad files or poorly named files or files that are in the wrong location. It is making sure that everything is where it needs to be. And by doing this way, you can kind of avoid a lot of the mess of managing a MAME installation. And I think that's nice. I think that's very valuable. There are other tools like this. ROM Vault, I believe, is one of them. I believe there's another one called ROM Center, if I'm remembering correctly. Your mileage may vary on this stuff. These are all kind of tools that will attack the same problem in slightly different ways. I have been using this tool for a very long time, and so I've become fairly comfortable with it. And every time I try to switch, I've downloaded, I believe, ROM Vault 5 or 6 times now over the years, going like, maybe this is better. Maybe I'm screwing up. Maybe, you know, maybe there's a better way out there. And I spend a day messing with it, or, you know, like I chip away at it here and there, and I kind of get it working, and I just look at it and go like, you know, I don't like it. I'm going to stick to what I know. I'm going to stick to what I'm comfortable with, but they all basically do the same thing. And so it is continuing to rebuild these sets. You see that, you know, like it gives you information as to what it's looking at and where it is rebuilding the files to and how it is zipping them up and some stats onto like, okay, well, we found a lot of files that match. We're creating these files and moving them around and all of this sort of stuff. And so you see we've got a filling up directory with a handful of other things here. This may be a good time to just briefly mention that there are some files in the MAME ROM set that are not individual games, and that you will need these in order to play certain types of games. I'll use Neo Geo as the example here. So you'll have, let's say, Magician Lord, which I believe may just be magician.zip. Let's look. No, that's not a MAME set, or not a Neo Geo set. You know what? We'll look at Metal Slug because that's much easier to find. So you'll have like, here's Metal Slug 2 and, you know, a variant of it called Metal Slug 2X. These are all the games, all the chips that are found inside of a Metal Slug 2 cartridge, but it does not include the chips that are part of the Neo Geo itself. And so there is a MAME set that is just called neogeo.zip, and this has the BIOS files and such that a Neo Geo would use to function. And so these don't get merged into your game files. neogeo.zip exists on its own. There are a handful of other sets like this, like a Naomi set of the kind of firmware and BIOS ROMs of the Naomi, which is Sega's Dreamcast-based arcade hardware. And so this is often a confusing case for people because they'll go out and they'll go like, I downloaded KOF98.zip and this game still won't run. It's telling me that I'm missing ROMs. In fact, I'll show you what that looks like. We'll grab Metal Slug 1 here and rebuild it. While we're at it. Okay. Now it's time to launch MAME. So again, you just want mame.exe. It'll fire up. And here you have the MAME interface. Now it's going to filter by, you know, well, it's unfiltered right now. You can opt to filter MAME a lot of different ways. Some games are in MAME but don't work because the emulation is partially complete. Some of them are mechanical, like all of these fruit machines we were talking about earlier. You know, some of those are just not going to work because, you know, MAME is meant to document as many different systems as possible. It's not necessarily about like, let's only focus on playable games or let's only focus on this. Like they're trying to catalog as much as they can because there's just a lot of shared hardware and shared CPUs across all of this technology. So it's like in a lot of cases, they've already done the work for it and they just need to wire it up a slightly different way. So we'll type into our search box here. We'll type in Pac-Man. No, let's type in Puckman. So we got Puckman Japan set 1. We'll hit return. It'll think about it for a sec. It'll give us this screen with some, you know, just some details about Pac-Man. And then there we have it. It's Pac-Man. Something that MAME does by default that I don't like is it puts this filter over the image. It looks a little blurry. I think it looks bad. And so I recommend turning it off. When you're inside of MAME, there are a handful of hotkeys you can use. F11 will bring this up in the corner. It'll tell you if the emulation is running at full speed or not. Thankfully, this PC is able to run Pac-Man at full speed. In fact, if we press F10, it will remove the speed limiter and run it as fast as it possibly can. And so you see it'll emulate Pac-Man at something like 2000% here. The escape key will quit the emulator back to the front end, and the tab key will bring up this menu. And the tab key is very valuable because it's how you configure just about everything. I think we can we go into these settings here and make some changes. This is, okay, yeah. Dip switches are going to be a lot of these games had little switches on the board. A lot of cases, this will be settings for games. When you get into newer games, a lot of the settings were built into the game themselves. And so you're really just hitting a switch to access the service mode, and then you're using the joystick to make changes. But a lot of these old cabinets had tiny little dip switches on the board, and you would look at the manual and go, okay, if I want to only have 2 lives per quarter, then we need to flip these 2 switches just so. In order to get what we need. Or if you're a dick and you're like, I think that it should cost 50 cents to play 1 game of Pac-Man, then you make those switches and flip them accordingly. To 2 coins, 1 credit. Or if you're extra generous, 1 coin can get you 2 credits. That'd be kind of cool. But input settings is really the thing we're looking to do here. So this is where you're going to configure your controls. And this is something that you'll do at a global level for all of MAME. And if you do that right, it will handle, let's say, 70 to 80% of arcade games. Depending on, it really depends on how many buttons they have. The weirder the controls get, the more custom work you will have to do. But if we account for all of that up front, then it can be okay. So we'll go to input assignments, general, and we'll do a couple of things here. There's, well, we don't care about the user interface stuff. We care about player 1 controls, and we care about other controls. So we'll start with player 1. A lot of this stuff will auto-configure depending on what kind of controller you have hooked up. These default settings may work quite well for you, but I like to go through them and set them all deliberately anyway. And so let's talk about what these are. Up, down, left, right for player 1 should be pretty obvious. I have a PlayStation 5 controller here that you can't see because it's being green screened out. Here it is. And so I am pushing up, down, left, right on the D-pad for this stuff. And remember that most arcade games did not have analog controls, and so I use the D-pad for this stuff because analog settings are somewhere else for racing games or some of these other games. Right stick, left stick is for games that use dual joysticks, like a Robotron or a Smash TV. And so for these left stick, up, down, left, right, I'm just going to actually be setting the same thing again. And for the right stick, I'm going to use the buttons because, again, these were not analog controls. And so I find the right analog stick to feel nasty and gross when playing games such as Smash TV and Robotron. And so I use the face buttons as a secondary right stick D-pad for these games. Again, you can set this however you want. If you want to use the analog sticks, then you're a monster, but go right ahead. I'm going to duplicate the left stick controls that we used above here for this. And this is like, for some people have arcade cabinets with wild control setups that's like, oh, we've got joystick and stuff for fighting games here, and then I got 2 joysticks here that you can use for dual joystick games. So it lets you set these independently because they don't want to assume what kind of controller you have. Buttons, you're rarely going to encounter a game that has 12 buttons. An arcade game that has 12 buttons. I map button 1 to the X button, button 2 to the square button, button 3 to the circle button, and button 4 to the triangle button. 5 and 6, I make L1 and R1. 7 and 8, I make the analog triggers, which you're going to see that looks a little weird there. Because it's an analog device, it'll say like, oh, it's an X rotation, it's a Y rotation. It's going to kind of think about those things differently. For button 9, I make that L3. For button 10, I make that R3. Again, these are just default setups. When you're going to play Street Fighter, it's going to have 6 buttons, and you're going to want to map them differently than this is mapped. And so you just have to kind of consider that. And all these other buttons, look. You could just unmap. Like, how many games are you going to play? Let's be honest with ourselves. I think I can hit the escape key here and not have a mapping for this. No, that will just stick with the, use joystick 1, button 2 to clear. So that's my circle button. We can just none these out if you want. For player 1 start, we hit select. So I'm going to use the share button on a PlayStation controller, but map a select button, map a start button. We're not going to map any Mahjong keys because we're not monsters. These are for some gambling machines that would have bet and deal and hold keys and, all this sort of stuff. You can map your analog pedals here as well. I tend to just map those on a per game basis, but yeah, you can just kind of, if you want to default, say, hey, R2 is my gas and L2 is my brake. That's usually pedal 1, pedal 2, depending on how they map it. If you are using a controller that does not have or has separate axes and different, you can map the increase and decrease separately for these pedals instead of just having a generic mapping, which is nice in some setups, but again, it's not something that I have here. For paddle, you'll find this in some kind of steering wheel type setups. I use the mouse for that stuff. It will also, like dial for Tempest. I tend to use the mouse for dials and trackballs, and a lot of this is already set up to expect a mouse. Same with light guns, I'll use the mouse. And so that's all we're going to map for our player 1 controls. Down in other controls, we need to map the start and select that we mapped back there is largely a console game start and select that you would use in like the Neo Geo set to console mode, for example. But you're also going to need to insert coins and press a start button. I double map the start button to both versions of the start, the start we saw over there and the player 1 start mapped here. And then I map coin 1 to my select button. The rest of this stuff, because I have a keyboard in front of me, I don't bother with it. If you are trying to go all controls because you've built some kind of weird cabinet, then you probably don't need to watch this video in the first place. So we're basically set up now. I can hit the select button to insert coins, and I can start a game. My D-pad works, and we're playing Puckman. Everyone's favorite dot muncher, Puckman. I'm eating ghosts. I'm feeling good. We're dead. I feel terrible. I hate Pac-Man. At any point, you can hit escape and go back. So, now that we're here, we can go into these other settings down here. We've got general settings and system settings. Here we have this kind of more generic video options. That blur that we were getting inside of Pac-Man is because this bilinear filtering is turned on. I'm going to turn that off. And that's basically all I'm going to do here. Depending on your monitor setup and whatever else, you may have a need to fuck around with VSync to avoid tearing, and so on. That is not something I have a problem with. If you want to run MAME in a window, you absolutely can. In fact, I usually do because I'm doing God knows what. Let's look at sound options and see what we got. Okay, so that's, yeah, sure. We'll turn cheats on. We don't have any cheat files in this directory, but that's, you can get some MAME cheats and that will populate into your tab menu when you are running a game. That information screen that we got when we launched the game, if you don't want to see those, you can just skip right to the game. If you're running on an older machine, I have upgraded PCs rather than deal with this specific functionality You can set it to skip frames. If you only want it to draw every other frame, for example, you can, I believe frame skip of 1 is that. And if you want it to skip every 2 frames, you can skip that. And all of these will kind of get the game running a little faster. Some games are not optimized to run on modern machines because the emulation is difficult. So if you're finding that you have a modern machine and there's just some game, some polygonal game, usually a newer quote unquote arcade game that is not running at full speed on your machine, it's usually because it's just not optimized. The emulation is not there yet, all this other stuff. But back when Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 were emulated by MAME, the PC I had could not run it right. You can set it to automatically skip frames, so if it detects that it can't run at full speed, it'll just start dropping frames to try to maintain full speed. Instead, I bought a new PC because playing Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 was important. It was important to me. We'll turn on low latency because why not? Adjust speed to match refresh rate. There are going to be esoteric options here that like I have never had to use. We do want to enable mouse input if we're going to play a light gun game later or something like that. And let's see, you can also, if you want to, if you want to keep your ROMs in a weird folder, you can do that. Or you can add a secondary folder, which is another kind of weird non-standard setting that I'm not really going to get into here. But generally speaking, that's kind of it. We'll see what systems setting. This is going to be, okay, so yeah, this is specific to the currently highlighted game. So MAME has all these filters. You can make your own custom filters over here if you so desire. You can also use an external front end if you like. Some people like Launchbox. I have been trying to use Launchbox lately because much like ROM Vault and some of these other tools, like every couple of years I go, oh man, I should see if Launchbox is any better and easier to use. And I think just because I've been using this stuff so long, I kind of don't need the front end most of the time. We copy, you know what, let's run Metal Slug and I'll show you that very specific case where we get this error. Now this is a lot of ROMs missing. You can see it's filling the screen and then some. We can't even scroll it down. So we have all of the right files we need for Metal Slug, but because we don't have the Neo Geo BIOS files in the right place, it's going to pop up this not found thing. The number one thing I see when I see people like trying to post error messages from emulators, it's this. And they always post something like this and they say, what does this mean? And it drives me crazy because what it means is the required ROM or disk images for the selected system are missing or incorrect, and that you need to acquire the correct files or just play something else. And here's a list of the files that MAME cannot find, that it needs to be able to find in order to launch the game. And what it's showing you here is the file name of the ROM, the set name that it belongs to, and it's letting you know that it can't find it. If it found a bad dump, it would let you know like, hey, there is a file here that we think is this. It's named this, but it's not the right file. When you use something like ClrMAME Pro, you prevent that scenario from really happening because you're auditing your ROMs, you're maintaining it, you're trimming it, you're pruning it, you're making sure that it's well shaped and perfect, so that you don't have to deal with that. Smash TV is a game I chose because of the dual joystick mapping that we did earlier. Now this is a situation where it should just work because I mapped those joysticks. The dual joystick nature of Smash TV, I mapped that in our generic global settings, so I shouldn't need to configure the controls on their own. If you want to do that, you can, and it will save those per game settings just fine.
Bingo! Let's go!
It's working perfectly. It's a great game. Smash TV. But if you decide, you know, if you decide you kind of want to mess with your stuff and do it differently, the P key used to pause, but I think because I'm using, well, this fresh install of MAME is not quite as configured the same way as my old one was. It's interesting to start fresh because I think a lot of the defaults and things that they've done have changed. As we've been doing this, I've been like, oh, like in a couple of cases, they'll be like, oh, it's not quite done the same way. Here's a case of a game that it just has a test switch that brings you into the mode where you can make changes. And this is kind of interesting. So if you ever want to know if your joysticks are configured properly in a game, you can go to one of these games that has a switch test, and you can see this is where we're moving the right stick around now, left, right, up, down. We're moving the left stick around. We're hitting the player 1 start button. We're inserting a coin into the left slot, and all of that. We need to hit player 1 and 2 start here to exit. I think, yeah, there we go. And you can make adjustments here to the difficulty of the game. You can set a game if you just don't want to dick around with inserting coins into a game. A lot of games will allow you to set it to free play. I find that the inserting of fake quarters gives me a rush of power. Like, look at all this fake money I'm feeding this game. It thinks it's in an arcade cabinet, but no, it's in my office. Suck on it. If you want to make it less violent, you can. Different games will have different options here, obviously. And then some of this stuff is interesting, you know, from the perspective of like, oh, you know, if you owned this machine and wanted to know how well it was doing, how many quarters went in and all that stuff, how long are people playing the game too long? Do I need to turn the difficulty up because they're getting too much value for their money and I want them to spend more money? How many times has the game crashed? How many people have reached the end of the game? That stuff is interesting. You know, in the situation where you're the only one playing it, it's a little less interesting. but I don't know. I always thought that stuff was kind of neat. Okay, we'll quit out of that. And I'm looking at my notes over here to see if there's any... to see what else we need to discuss here. This general settings thing, if you don't want to deal with some of these options in this menu, this menu has gotten so much better over the years. I mean, this whole UI used to not exist. MAME was just a command line app. And there was a UI version of it that had a very Windows look and feel to it, but that isn't around in the same way it used to be. And so, but they built this UI that is fine. But if you, for whatever reason, want to change things the old-fashioned way, it does just create any file in a directory here. And a lot of the options that you saw in that menu, we can just go set zeros to ones or whatever else. This is a good way to get into trouble. This is maybe an advanced tactic that you probably don't need to really mess around with unless you know what the heck you're doing. So I might say stick to the existing menus. You probably don't need to go too deep into editing those files. But I will say your individual game configs will live in situations like this. And these are just kind of just basic XML files here. And well, I guess we didn't make any changes to any of those, but you can see you know what? These are not good. These used to be much more editable as well. But I'm going to say maybe don't touch these either because if we look at our default settings, it's joy codes and all this other stuff. That's actually a major improvement they made. You would have a situation, MAME used to do this thing where, and this is a big reason of why I still don't use wireless controllers. You map MAME using a specific controller. Let's say you have a wireless Xbox 360 controller and you're using that to play all your games. You have it turned on, you launch MAME, you configure all the controls, you quit out, whatever. You sit down at your computer the next day, you launch MAME, and then you realize, oh, the controller isn't turned on. Because that controller wasn't connected to your PC, MAME launches. It doesn't work this way anymore, for the record. But MAME would launch, it would go, there's no joystick here, and it would wipe all of your settings. It would go like, that joystick doesn't exist anymore, so we're going to totally edit all of these config files to remove that joystick from them. And if you relaunch with the joystick turned on next time, it doesn't automatically put it all back. You would have to manually go back and remap what we did to remap all those controls. You would have to do that again. And so I don't use, because of the number of times I did that, I stopped using wireless controllers. And that's a big part of like that was the catalyst, I think, for me no longer using a wireless controller. And I still don't. Even though MAME has fixed that specific issue, at least that's my understanding of it. I try not to test it. I try not to test it in those situations. We'll take this Neo Geo file, we'll drag it down here, and we'll put it in. It's going to copy it over. Oh, sorry. One more thing here. This NVRAM directory is going to be like certain settings that are stored, like when we went into that config menu in Smash TV and we could adjust the pricing in the other settings, that stuff is going to be stored in this NVRAM, non-volatile RAM file. And if you delete that, then you will basically get kind of a fresh start of the arcade machine next time you launch it. If you delete the saved files of its high scores and whatever else, if you delete those files, that's a good way to kind of freshen things up. If you messed up the configuration in some weird way, just delete all your config files and it'll figure it out. So now that we've copied that Neo Geo stuff over, we can launch Metal Slug and it will do this. And this is something that, like there are a lot of different versions of the Neo Geo hardware. And so it allows you to choose which system do you want. Do you want the ROMs used for that weird Japanese hotel Neo Geo? Do you want the hacked universe BIOS, which has a built-in cheat database and lets you switch regions and all this other stuff? It's like an amazing thing to have if you have a real Neo Geo. Because you can enable blood codes more easily and some of the other weird stuff you would have to do. I tend to go for the universe BIOS, honestly. And the universe BIOS comes up like this. It lets you know it's emulating the European arcade hardware. And now here we are in Metal Slug. Now, if you are playing Metal Slug, and as I'm playing Metal Slug, I'm looking at these buttons and I'm thinking these are not how I want these buttons to be. Button 1 is shoot and button 2 is jump. So like X is shoot and square is jump. That should be the other way. And so we're just going to go onto our input settings. We're going to do input assignments for this system, and it will tell you, and this is where you'll get friendlier versions of these button names in a lot of cases too, where we're going to say, okay, we want this to be A, we want this to be B. We're okay with C staying as C. That's our grenade button, and that's on the circle button, which is okay. You could put it on a shoulder button if you want. You can do whatever you want. It's yours. Like, make it your own. When it comes to configuring controls, configure the controls in ways that make the game easier, or or whatever. Like, whatever makes the most sense to you is almost always going to be the right answer. Now you see that we don't have blood, and that's no good. Because we have that universe BIOS installed, we can actually just hold down A, B, C, and press start. And I think what we can do here is we can go into the cheats here, and I think we can just turn on... I don't know. I don't know how... There would be a way to do it from here, but actually probably what you do is we reboot the system here, and we just set it up here instead. That was another ABC and start type thing. The universe BIOS is great. This is, again, beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but just to let you know here, we can set this to be the Japanese BIOS. We can make it into the console instead of the arcade board, if you want. And Neo Geo games will behave differently depending on what you're doing there, and I'm screwing a bunch of stuff up here, but whatever. We're done playing Metal Slug anyway. But because I just set all those settings in a weird way, I am going to go in here and just I'm going to delete that that file, so that stuff is not lingering around next time I go to play. But the config file does stay, and you see we have our Metal Slug config file here where we remapped some buttons, and so that's in there. The other thing that ClrMAME Pro does is it scans, and it lets you know, it looks at your ROM directory, which we have told it is this directory right here, but it will look at your MAME set, and it will tell you what you have and what you don't. And so we'll run this scan here. It's going to remove an unnecessary file that it found in the samples directory. And it's going to go and do what it did before here. It's going to find some, hey, you've got a file somewhere in here that applies to this game. Do you want to add that? And you're like, yeah. Generally, when you're doing this, you can kind of hit yes to all, because it's always going to, it's going to make the right decisions for, you rebuilding an accurate ROM set. And it's going to run, and it's going to do its thing, and then it's going to tell us what we have, or it's going to tell us what we're missing by default. And so with ClrMAME, you can import database files that are DAT files, .dat. You may have heard me speak about .dat files. And there are groups out there that maintain these DAT files for pretty much any platform you can imagine that is emulated. So you can find DAT files for the N64, and it'll be like, okay, here's every N64 game that we know about, and it's a known good dump. And so you can scan, and it'll tell you what you have and what you don't have, and what you're missing. And these DAT files get updated all the time, especially these days, because the people that are maintaining the DAT files for console games are oftentimes now including a lot of aftermarket, more recently released kind of homebrew stuff. They've started tracking more and more of that as time has gone on. And so it's a great way to keep up with new homebrew releases, or in some cases they've gone and they've taken some of these ROM collections that are being sold on Steam. We'll have modified versions of these games in there, just ever so, not that so much that you'd notice. It's usually the copyright notice is changed, and it has a little bit less flashing for, the kind of modern epilepsy warning type of situation. It'll track those and say oh, this is Contra, taken from the Contra Anniversary Collection found on Steam. It knows what's what. Do you need all of these files? Of course not. And some people get into I want to curate my set so that I only have one version of every game. I don't need 5 versions of Contra. I just need the one version of Contra. I look at it as this process is so streamlined for me right now of maintaining these sets that it would take me way longer to try to curate it and go I only want one of these, and I only want one of these. Again, these files, especially for a lot of that era of console hardware, they do not take up that much space. And it's easier to just have it all. So that is my approach. Okay. This is getting there. It's on the T's. It's on the V's. Oh, it's scan. Okay, yeah, no, it's not necessarily. It is going alphabetically by set name, not by game name. So the scan results that are flickering by, it is only on the M's. I see. Um, this is a relatively fast scan. Things like NES scans will be a lot faster than this because it's usually one file per set. It's just a .NES file, you know. If you're looking at larger files, like you have images of CD-ROMs, like let's say you had devoted a terabyte or whatever to, or believe multiple I forget how big it is. If you had devoted a lot of drive space to maintaining 11,000 PlayStation 1 games, that's a scan that if you were to click, if I were to do such a thing, if I were to click this button and run that scan, it's like leave the PC on overnight, like 9 hours type stuff, or like wake up in the morning and click that button and it'll maybe be done by bedtime, because that is the longest scan. Saturn's pretty long, Dreamcast can be pretty long, but PlayStation 1, well, you know, of the stuff I've encountered, because there's a lot of stuff that I don't, you know, like it only gets bigger from there, right? Like I don't want to have, hard drives are cheap, but not cheap enough for me to say, let's have every PlayStation 2 game, because that's, you know, some of those are 9 gigs a pop. And when you get into some of those emulators that deal with optical media, CD-ROMs, DVD-ROMs, they don't want you to zip them up to save space. They need to be unzipped to boot in some cases. And so that's a lot of space, more space than I'm willing to devote. And some of them I just don't care about. Like, you know, I'm sure there's someone out there that has every GameCube game on a hard drive somewhere. That's just not my bag, man. I'm not that interested in some of that stuff. But the tools of the trade are largely the same for maintaining these accurate versions of these games. While this is happening, so yeah, MAME emulates a lot of games. There are some games where it will have what it calls imperfect emulation. If you launch a game in MAME and it pops up and it says like, hey, the graphics are messed up or the sound is messed up, like there's nothing you can do unless you are going to go contribute code to MAME. It is an open source project, so if you're smart enough to do that, I highly recommend it. I would love for more people to be working on MAME and more people to be discovering this stuff. It's been really great having the FPGA stuff come into the overall emulation scene, because it's provided an opportunity for a lot of people to come in and start over. And they use MAME as a guide in some cases. I believe the most recent example of this was, WWF WrestleFest, the Technos wrestling game. Someone just reproduced that for the Analog Pocket, and for some political reason did not make it for the MiSTer, which is frustrating, but whatever. I don't, the scene is a scene with all of the positives and negatives that come with that sometimes, right? But in there, the developer of the FPGA core said, yeah, I looked at MAME for a lot of this, and along the way I found some things that I verified with real hardware that MAME had wrong. And so I'm going to document this stuff, and then if someone else wants to go use that to then fix MAME, they can. And so there's kind of this leapfrog effect of like, everyone is kind of standing on each other's shoulders a little bit and finding out more as they go. In a lot of cases, some of these developers will then contribute code back to MAME. This developer, I believe, chose to just document it, and, you know, will allow someone else to do the work on that one, because he's going to move on to more FPGA based stuff, because that's where his strengths lie. Either way, it's been great because it's allowed a lot of this work from MAME that, you know, some of it was done decades ago, and some of it maybe hasn't been touched in a long time and hasn't been verified or peer reviewed or what have you. And so a lot of this new FPGA core development for arcade games has led to corrections being made in the emulation in MAME. And so everything gets better along the way. That's the ideal scenario when you're dealing with, you know, some of this open source software. So our scan is complete. Let's go look at Frogger. It pulled a file for Frogger, right? But it didn't it? Let's look at one of these. Okay, Amadar. Amadar is a 1K file. There's no way that's a full Amadar set. You'll notice that Amiga ROMs are in here. That's because there is a whole other side of MAME that can be used to play computer games and console games and all of this other stuff that, you know, you often think about as running well in other emulators. Plenty of that stuff can be run really well in MAME. MAME is one of the better CDI emulators right now, which is to say none of them are perfect, but MAME is pretty good for playing CDI games in some cases. Okay, so you see some of these icons are a little different. That's because we have a, like for some of these games, we don't have any of it. It says missing set, and then it lets you know what ROMs we're missing, the file hashes of those, both a CRC32 and a SHA-1, which are different ways of saying here's the signature for the correct version of this file. For Amadar, we do have one of those files up here because it pulled it out of the Pac-Man sets. Because it was similar or rather identical files. But we can't play Amadar because we're still missing these files. And so we would get that same error message that we got with the Neo Geo game if we went and go try to play Amadar right now. But now that we've run this scan once, we can actually run a much faster version of it, and it will store that across sessions. So we'll take Amadar, and you can actually just drag things onto the scan window, and you don't have to go all the way over to the rebuilder and do all this stuff. You can just drag stuff on directly and it will do its thing. And then at the end of that, it will kind of scan again. And now you see up here with this zip file, we do have a much more substantial 215K of hot Amadar files. The number of times this, and you know, because we're dealing with a big database scan of missing files and all this stuff, you see it did hang there for a little bit, but then eventually did kind of catch up and say like, okay, no, this is what we're doing. That'll happen sometimes. Again, you know, if you want to take what I'm teaching you here and try to apply it to something like ROM Vault, be my guest. ROM Vault is, you know, all of the software is maintained. Like there are new versions of ClrMAME Pro when necessary. It is largely MAME focused, though it can do all these other systems just fine. But the MAME focus means that I feel like a lot of the updates and changes and patches to this software are because of changes that are happening in MAME, and making sure that it works, you know, in lockstep with MAME. And so it'll run this scan, and Amadar will no longer be on the list, as well as all of the Amadar clones, because we've got it up here now. We've got this full Amadar set. We are sitting pretty with as much Amadar as the law will allow. In fact, some might say way more Amadar than the law technically allows. But I am not a lawyer. I just love Amadar. Oh, I love Amadar. All right, we'll let this scan finish up. And I'm kind of looking at my notes here to see, I wish that we got the 7Z stuff to work because I would have liked that, but generally speaking, this is how I do it. And so when a new version of MAME is released and you want to update, I unzip the new version of MAME on top of my existing MAME installation. It replaces the files. And then the next time you launch CM Pro and click on the MAME entry, it will pop up that thing that says a database, and we need to scrape the database again because it detects that, hey, this is a different file. What are you doing? And it will go and update it, and then it'll run a new scan. If files need to be moved from one zip file to another because things have changed, it will pop up and say, hey, do you want to do this? That's what these fix checkboxes do, is it will let it know like, hey, I want you to fix this stuff because we do want it to fix this stuff. And then it will tell you at the end what you're missing. Like generally it's like, here's the new stuff that came out over the last month. And now it's up to you to go find that. That's, that stuff's out there. You just got to know where to grab it. That's not something for here. It's like what? It's like on archive.org. I don't know. Like the stuff's around. Are there other better sites than that for that? Of course. Am I going to talk to you about them here? Unfortunately, no. Google it while you still can before Google goes even further off the reservation and becomes even worse and harder to use. But all this stuff is out there, man. And the nice thing about this is if you just find some sketchy like link and it says like, here's this game. If you have your database, you can always run it through that and it will tell you, is this the right good version of this game or is it something strange? Not to say that it's something dangerous or a virus or whatever, but if you go to download a PlayStation game and it's .exe, maybe throw that away. Maybe just throw that out and find it somewhere else. But it will catalog it and it'll be like, oh, hey, yeah, this is the revision 1 version of this Crash Bandicoot beta from this date and it will help you identify this stuff and let you know what you have. Now when dealing with optical media and the file formats there is like a lot of nuance there around that we will get into in a later installment. We will revisit ClrMAME Pro as it relates to DAT files and console games and so on. That is kind of the next phase of this. But I find that understanding it here for MAME provides a good enough foundation to kind of move forward. Because in some ways, MAME sets are some of the most complicated stuff you'll deal with simply because it's a bunch of randomly named multiple files that can be stored in different ways depending on how you want to zip them up. And so starting here and getting your feet wet with that, I think will hopefully, if I've done an okay job here, will help you kind of get your feet wet for what's to come. And yeah, as I look at my notes, I think I pretty much hit the bullet points here. Again, there's some advanced stuff with MAME when it relates to playing Apple II games. And so like I have in my old MAME directory, I have this software directory. And as you see in here, it's got a bunch of 32X games and it's got a bunch of Amiga demos and like all these weirdly named directories. And here's a bunch of Apple II cassettes and then some Apple II floppies that were cleanly cracked by 4 a.m. the person. And then here's some other Apple II, so they have this concept of software lists in MAME. And again, we're not going to get into that right now. Software lists is beyond the scope of this kind of entry level thing. But if you want to use MAME to play Commodore 64 games, NES games, it'll run PlayStation games. Like this is where you kind of run into some situations where, because MAME is not necessarily built for speed, if you go and try and run Dreamcast games in MAME, you can kind of do it, but you're better off finding something like Flycast, which is just a little more modernly built and is going to be in a lot of ways a more accurate experience as well. But for a lot of random weird computers, MAME is the only option available. And it's great to be able to dig into some of that stuff. Like it's the sort of thing where MAME will play Amiga games, but probably not as easily as UAE, a very specific Amiga emulator, will run them. As an example. So it's run that scan, and now here we are. We're still missing a bunch of games, but that's because we've got to move all of this stuff over to this stuff. And I'm going to test some functionality right now that I don't think works. But so one thing I'll say One more thing I'll say about CHD files, which are again the compressed hard drive and CD-ROM drive images and all of that sort of stuff. So we have like, you know, Beatmania 2 DX here. This shouldn't work. Or last time I tried it, it did not deal with CHDs in this specific way. Yeah, and that is still the case. So for CHD files, it will scan them and let you know if they're right or not, but it will not move them to a new directory for you. And we're not going to let this scan run again because it didn't change anything. So I am going to take my CHDs and just manually move them over to this directory. That is something you will kind of have to contend with. The scan window will let you know when you are missing a CHD, and it will let you know if a CHD that you have is wrong. But for whatever reason, it cannot scan the CHDs and move them to the appropriate directory. I don't know why that limitation exists. It could be that, you know, in a lot of cases, there are multiple versions of a file that can work as the CHD. Because there are multiple, the CHD file format has changed over the years. And so you might have an old version, like a version 3 CHD as opposed to a version 5 CHD. And so there's weird concepts like that make CHD files a little bit more complicated than just straight up ROM dumps. I'm assuming that's why that's the case. And I think that's it. I think that is basically what you'll need to know to get MAME up and running and how to maintain a ROM set for MAME going forward. You know, you supply the files and it does the thinking, and CM Pro will put the files where they need to be. And you should be good to go on the other end of that. Right? Right. Okay. So I believe that's going to do it for this first installment. I hope that you find this to be more than just a bunch of gibberish and jargon spit at you. I hope that you get something tactically useful out of this when it comes to you know, using MAME and all of this other stuff. In the future, I have some notes here. In the future, we'll get into just organizing ROM sets of different platforms. Like I said, when we're dealing with the Super Nintendo or the PlayStation or the Dreamcast or the MSX. Things you can do to maintain those sets and know if you have the right stuff or if there's stuff you're missing or if you've just got too much. Because over the years, there's been a lot of bad dumps, weird dumps out there. You might just have a bunch of bad stuff. So how to use ClrMAME Pro with those types of ROMs and how to organize those sets is what we'll get into next. We will get into, I will almost certainly dedicate an entire installment to RetroArch, which has become a popular emulator for a lot of different platforms. It's a good front end. It exists on a lot of different devices. And so I find that if you learn how to set up RetroArch properly on an actual PC where you have very easy access to all of the directories and files and folders, and you have a keyboard in front of you and all of that stuff, once you've wrapped your mind around that once, maintaining an installation like that on your Steam Deck or on a modified Nintendo Switch, you know, like the directories and basic concepts are the same across most platforms. And so we will get into that, and I'll show you how I set up a RetroArch install, which I've gotten pretty fast at doing it, I'll say. I will probably devote episodes to the Mister and the Analog Pocket. I did get some requests for that. The Mister is really cool because it can look on your network. And so basically the way I have things set up is I use ClrMAME Pro to sort the ROMs into the appropriate directories. And then the emulators on the PC know to look there, but also they're sorted into the right directory for the Mister to use automatically, even though it is not, it is just on my network. By the use of Samba shares, I am able to do that. And that's really awesome. And so keeping a Mister up to date and using the update all script, which is quite easy, but we'll walk through it anyway. There's a similar script for the Analog Pocket, which I used to have right here, and I was going to pick up and go with the Analog Pocket, but it's out of arm's reach over there. When it comes to running the Open FPGA cores on an Analog Pocket and updating that to the latest versions, there's a script for that as well that I use, and I will talk to you about that. And that's, that's mostly what I have planned so far. We'll see where it goes from there. If there are other topics that people have questions on, then, we'll dig into that. There's some stuff that I am like with ROM Vault and some of these other tools, there are definitely some aspects of this that are not really my focus or have not been. And so there's definitely some stuff that I don't know that I would be willing to at least try to learn in some cases if people want some help with something specific. I'm not going to get into any of the, recently court case. Like, I'm not going to be like, here's how to find Yuzu and get it, like, I'm not going to get into any of that stuff because I'm just not that interested in it. And it's too hot. It's too hot, son. This shit is all over the streets. There's too much smoke on the street for that. We got to lay low, keep our heads down. Give it 5 years. Something like that. But like DuckStation and some of these PlayStation style emulators that, have like their own front ends that are really nice. And, maybe we could take a look at some of that if people are interested. Or if people need the help, I suppose, like that stuff's, I find that stuff to be exceedingly straightforward these days. So I would recommend actually, if you're looking for an easy way to play PlayStation games, DuckStation's a good way to go. For PlayStation 2, really PCSX2 is really the only way to go in most cases. And yeah. And then once you get into the kind of more modern machines, I think once we get past like PlayStation and Saturn, and I guess maybe PS2 and Dreamcast, everything else is complicated. Or more complicated. You get into Xbox games that don't run right in the Xbox emulator. When you move on to PS3 and Xbox 360, you start to run into weird, like, we need disk keys and we need to do this to encryption and we need to get this, and we are installing it to a fake hard drive that the fake PS3 can see, and the hoops there are a little bit different. And the tools are quite similar to what people who were bootlegging games for those consoles back in the day would use. Which is weird. It's weird. It's not just like, you don't just have like a .ps3 file and you drag it in here and it boots up like you do with SNES games and all this other stuff. Like it starts to get way more complicated. And the newer it is, I find the less interested I am, with the possible exception of 50 Cent Blood on the Sand, which runs great on a PC. So maybe we will get into that. But we can talk about that down the road. Thanks everyone for checking this out. Thanks everyone for backing the Patreon and allowing me to enter your homes on a regular basis and root around in your things and use your bathroom and, take a dump in your fridge. That was me, by the way. You're welcome. But thanks for backing the Patreon. Thanks for hanging out with me and making all this stuff a reality. Hopefully this is something that you find useful, and we can going forward do some more stuff along these lines so that you can experience this joy and magic the same way that I do. Until then, take care of yourself. I'll see you.